Long, long ago, in a peaceful African village, nestled between rolling hills and tall, ancient trees, there lived a happy family. The village was known for its close-knit community, where everyone knew each other, and the days were filled with the sounds of children laughing, birds singing, and the occasional drum beats from the village square. In this village stood a modest but beautiful home made of clay and thatch, with a yard where the family would gather under the shade of a large baobab tree to share stories and meals. This family consisted of a father, a mother, and their 3 grown children, 2 daughters and 1 son. The father, a man of great wisdom and strength, was known throughout the village as a hard worker. From sunrise to sunset, he worked the fields, tending to crops and livestock, ensuring that there was always food on the table. He would often come home with baskets of fresh vegetables and fruits, his clothes dusty from the fields, but his face always beaming with pride as he greeted his family. His hands, though rough from labor, were gentle when he hugged his children, and his laughter filled their home with warmth. The mother, a kind and nurturing woman, was the heart of the household. She was known for her skill in making beautiful traditional clothes, weaving intricate patterns that reflected their rich cultural heritage. Her cooking filled the air with delicious aromas, and there was always a pot of stew simmering on the fire or freshly baked bread waiting for the family to enjoy. She spent her days tending the home, caring for the family's small garden, and preparing meals that nourished both body and soul. Her laughter was soft and soothing, and she was always there with a word of wisdom or comfort when needed. Their children, all grown but still living under their parents' roof, were a source of great joy and pride. The 2 daughters were known for their beauty, kindness, and respectfulness. They often helped their mother with household chores and took great pride in learning the traditional skills passed down from generation to generation. One daughter, the elder, was skilled in pottery, creating beautiful clay pots and vases that the family used for cooking and storing water. The younger daughter had a talent for weaving, just like her mother, and she was learning to master the art of creating colorful, intricate fabrics that would one day be the envy of the village. The son, strong and hardworking like his father, spent his days assisting his father in the fields. He was also known for his bravery and was often called upon to help with village matters, whether it was mending fences or protecting the livestock from wild animals. Despite the demands of the day, the son was always respectful and took care to spend time with his family. In the evenings, he would sit with his father, listening to stories of their ancestors, absorbing the lessons of courage, honor, and wisdom. The family had no problems, and they lived a simple and joyful life. Every evening, they would gather under the large tree outside their home to share stories and laugh together. The daughters would braid each other's hair while the son sat close by, listening to their father recount tales of old warriors and the spirit of their ancestors. The mother would sit quietly, sewing or weaving, with a gentle smile as she watched her family, her heart filled with pride and contentment. Life was peaceful, and their home was a place of warmth, love, and harmony. They didn't have many riches, but they were rich in love and togetherness, and that was enough. Their home, though simple, was always filled with laughter and joy. The children, though grown, were respectful and dutiful, always helping their parents without complaint. They took great pride in their family and the traditions they upheld, making sure that every custom and ritual was honored. The father would often say, "As long as we have each other, we are the richest family in the world," and the family believed this to be true. They were content with their lives, grateful for the blessings they had, and thankful for the love that bound them together. One day, as the sun rose and painted the village with its golden light, the father prepared to leave for the fields. As always, he kissed his wife on the cheek and patted his children on the head with a warm smile. "I'll be back before sunset," he said, his voice full of his usual cheer. The mother, standing at the door, watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the tall grass of the fields. She turned back into the house, humming a soft tune as she went about her daily chores. The morning was peaceful. The birds chirped in the trees, and a soft breeze blew through the open windows, carrying with it the scent of freshly tilled earth from the fields. The children were busy with their tasks. The daughters were tending to the small vegetable garden, plucking ripe tomatoes and herbs, while the son was sharpening tools for his father's work. Inside the house, the mother was sweeping the floors and preparing a pot of stew that would simmer all day. The sound of the broom swishing against the floor was the only noise in the quiet, calm house. But then something unusual happened. In the distance, the mother heard the sound of footsteps, soft yet purposeful, approaching their home. She frowned slightly, curious as to who it could be. It wasn't common for visitors to come by at this time of day, especially when most of the men, including her husband, were working in the fields. A few moments later, there was a soft knock on the door. The mother set her broom aside and wiped her hands on her apron before walking over to answer it. When she opened the door, she found a strange woman standing on the doorstep. The woman was dressed simply, but her clothes were worn and dusty, as if she had traveled a long way. Her face was hidden under the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, and her eyes, though calm, held a certain sadness. The mother's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't often that strangers came to their home, and there was something about this woman's presence that unsettled her. Still, being the gracious and polite woman that she was, she greeted the stranger with a warm smile. "Good morning," the mother said, her voice kind but curious. "How can I help you? My husband is not here. He's gone to work in the fields." The strange woman stood on the doorstep, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Yes," she said, her voice low and steady. "My mother told me that my father lives here. She said he has a family now, but I'm his daughter, his stepdaughter. I have come to see him after many years." The words hit the wife like a bolt of lightning. She felt her body stiffen as confusion and disbelief swirled in her mind. She stared at the woman standing before her, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. A stepdaughter? Her thoughts raced. How could that be? Her husband had never mentioned anything about a daughter from another relationship. They had been married for so many years, and he had always been honest, or so she believed. The wife's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a drum of growing anger. She felt her legs tremble beneath her, as if the very ground beneath her feet was shaking. The peaceful morning air, once filled with birdsong and the rustle of leaves, now seemed oppressive, heavy with the weight of the stranger's words. The sun that once shone so brightly now seemed harsh, casting long shadows across the yard. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. For a moment, she stood frozen, her thoughts a jumbled mess of confusion, hurt, and betrayal. Could this woman be telling the truth? She wondered, her mind spinning. Her husband had always been a loving father to their children, a devoted partner, but could he have been keeping such a secret from her all these years? Could there really be another child, hidden away, unknown to her? The more she thought about it, the more the anger in her chest began to boil, slowly overtaking her confusion. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, as a deep sense of betrayal washed over her. She had loved her husband with all her heart, trusted him completely, and now, standing before her, was this woman claiming to be his stepdaughter, a daughter she had never known about, a child from another life that he had kept hidden. The woman on the doorstep shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in the wife's demeanor. I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said, her voice now softer, almost pleading. "I just wanted to see him. It's been so many years, and I thought..." But the wife could no longer hear her words. Her ears were ringing with the echoes of her own thoughts, drowning out the stranger's voice. The anger inside her grew like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path: her love, her trust, her peace of mind. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, her heart beating faster, her breath quickening as the emotions surged within her. "How dare you?" the wife finally spat out, her voice trembling with fury. "How dare you come here to my home and say such things? My husband has no other children. He has never hidden anything from me." Her voice grew louder with each word, her anger spilling out like a flood. The strange woman took a step back, her eyes wide with shock. "I'm not lying," she stammered. "My mother told me." "Your mother?" the wife interrupted, her voice now dripping with contempt. "Who is this mother of yours? Some woman from his past? Some secret affair? Do you think you can just walk into my life and tear my family apart with your lies? The woman opened her mouth to speak, but the wife didn't give her a chance. You are nothing but a liar, she shouted, her hands shaking with rage. My husband would never betray me like this. He would never hide something so important from me. In that moment, the wife's heart was consumed by anger. She could not see past her rage, could not think clearly. All she knew was the burning betrayal she felt deep inside. Her mind raced with images of her husband leading a double life, of lies and secrets that had been hidden from her for so many years. She could not bear the thought of it. Her mind, clouded with fury, refused to consider any other possibility. She didn't stop to ask the woman more questions or investigate the truth. She didn't think to confront her husband or give him a chance to explain. Instead, she let the anger fester, building into a storm that would soon spiral out of control. You have no place here, the wife continued, her voice shaking. Get out. Leave this place and never come back. You are not welcome here. The woman, stunned and hurt by the outburst, backed away from the door. She had not expected such a reaction, and her eyes filled with tears as she realized that she had made a terrible mistake. With a final glance at the house, the woman turned and left, her figure disappearing into the village as the wife slammed the door behind her. Inside, the wife's chest heaved with heavy breaths as she stood by the closed door. Her hands were shaking, and her mind was racing. How could this have happened, she thought. Why didn't he tell me? But instead of seeking answers, she allowed her anger to grow. And as the hours passed, her rage turned into something much darker, hatred. She felt as though the love she had once had for her husband was slipping away, replaced by the deep, painful wound of betrayal. The trust that had once been the foundation of their marriage had been shattered. From that moment on, nothing in the household would be the same again. Without patience or a single thought of investigation, the wife, blinded by her rage, cursed her husband in the heat of the moment. Her heart, once filled with love and tenderness, was now poisoned by anger and the sense of betrayal she couldn't shake off. She wished harm upon him, her words filled with venom and bitterness. She didn't care to hear his side of the story. To her, there was only one truth. He had hidden something from her, and she would never forgive him. That very same day, as if her angry words carried a dark curse, the husband, while at work in the fields, suddenly collapsed. His strong hands, which had toiled so many years to provide for his family, went limp. His legs, once so steady, buckled beneath him. His breath became shallow, and his heart raced. When the villagers found him, he was barely conscious, unable to speak or move. They carried him home, their faces filled with concern and whispers of fear on their lips. The news of his sudden illness spread quickly through the village. Neighbors gathered outside the family's home, whispering prayers and offering condolences. But the wife, still consumed by anger, paid no attention. When the children brought their father home and laid him on the bed, his face pale and weak, the wife stood at the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes cold. She didn't cry. She didn't ask how he was, or if there was anything that could be done to help. Instead, she stared at him with a heart hardened by fury. He deserves this, she thought to herself, her mind filled with the bitterness that had taken root deep inside her. She believed his illness was a punishment for betraying her trust. She had wished harm upon him, and now it seemed that her curse had come true. The husband, once strong and healthy, was now bedridden. He could barely move, his body paralyzed from the stroke. He tried to speak, to explain, but his words came out in slurred whispers. The wife, however, refused to listen. She turned her back on him, leaving him in his sickbed without so much as a word of comfort. Instead of showing any compassion, her anger only grew. She refused to care for him, leaving the responsibility to their children. Day after day, she ignored his presence, moving around the house as if he didn't exist. Her bitterness consumed her so fully that she couldn't bring herself to even look at him without feeling the sting of betrayal. The children, on the other hand, were heartbroken. They loved their father deeply, and seeing him in such a weakened state filled them with sorrow. Every day, they took turns sitting by his bedside, feeding him, giving him water, and ensuring that he was as comfortable as possible. The daughters would gently wipe his brow and whisper soft words of comfort. while the son, though still young, tried to lift his father's spirits by talking to him about the things they used to enjoy together. They remembered the strength of their father, the way he had always been there for them, and now they wanted to do the same for him. The children, though devastated, never stopped caring for him. They would sit by his bedside, holding his hand and telling him stories of the outside world, of the sun that still shone bright, the birds that sang, and the village life that continued on, even as their own world was crumbling. They hoped that their care and love would bring him some relief, but it was clear that their father was growing weaker each day. The wife, meanwhile, remained distant. She didn't even enter the room where her husband lay, her anger still smoldering like a fire that refused to die. She believed that his illness was deserved, that it was the result of his deceit, and nothing could change her mind. Even as the days stretched into weeks and her husband's condition worsened, she remained cold and unmoved. Her bitterness had blinded her to the truth that lay just beyond her anger, and it would only be a matter of time before the consequences of her actions would come back to haunt her. As the days passed, the wife's anger only grew stronger. Her heart was filled with so much bitterness that she could no longer see her husband as the man she once loved. Every time she looked at him, lying helpless in his bed, unable to speak or move, her rage deepened. She couldn't stand the sight of him anymore, and her anger turned into something much darker. In her twisted mind, the wife began to think of ways to end her husband's suffering and to rid herself of the pain she felt every time she saw him. She convinced herself that the only way to be free from this torment was to make sure he was gone for good. Her mind, consumed by anger and hurt, began to plot a way to kill him. She told herself that it would be better for everyone if he was no longer alive, that his suffering would end, and so would hers. One night, as the house was quiet and the children had gone to sleep, the wife quietly entered the room where her husband lay. The moonlight shone through the small window, casting long shadows on the walls. She stood by his bedside, her heart pounding in her chest. He was barely awake, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. He looked so weak, so fragile. She stood there for a moment, watching him, her mind racing. She had made up her mind. She would end it tonight. She reached for the pillow beside him, her hands trembling. But as she lifted it, something inside her stopped her. It was as though an unseen force held her back, stopping her from going through with her plan. Her hands shook as she stood over him, and she could feel her heart beating faster and faster. For some reason, she couldn't do it. No matter how much she hated him, no matter how angry she was, something deep inside her stopped her from taking his life. She dropped the pillow back onto the bed, her breath coming in short, heavy gasps. She backed away from the bed, her body shaking, and left the room, her mind spinning with confusion. She didn't understand what had just happened. She wanted him gone, so why couldn't she go through with it? The wife returned to her own bed, but she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were a mess of anger, guilt, and frustration. As the days went on, her husband's condition grew worse. He could barely eat or drink, and the children were the only ones caring for him. The wife, tired of seeing him in such a state, decided that she had had enough. She could no longer bear to watch him suffer, and she wanted the situation to end. So one morning, she lied to her family. She told them that her husband had died in the night, that his suffering had finally come to an end. The children, heartbroken, believed their mother's words. They were devastated, but they trusted her. They didn't question her story, and they began to mourn the loss of their father. The wife wasted no time. She quickly arranged for her husband's body to be taken to the mortuary. But even though her husband was still alive, barely clinging to life, she sent him away as though he were already dead. When the mortuary man saw that the husband was still breathing, he was shocked. He wanted to help, but there was nothing he could do. He was not a doctor, and the wife had already told everyone that her husband had passed away. With no other options, the mortuary man kept the husband in the cold, dark room, waiting for the inevitable. Meanwhile, the wife went about convincing the rest of the family and the village that her husband had died. She put on a show of grief, pretending to be heartbroken, though in her heart, she felt nothing but relief. The children, still mourning their father, trusted her completely. They never suspected that their father was still alive, barely hanging on in the mortuary. The family began to make preparations for the funeral, unaware of the terrible truth that lay hidden. The wife believed that her nightmare was finally coming to an end, but little did she know that the consequences of her actions were far from over. After 7 days, the family gathered to hold the funeral. It was a somber occasion, with the entire village coming together to pay their respects. The sound of drums filled the air as mourners dressed in traditional clothing made their way to the family's home. The wife stood by the grave, her face expressionless, though she pretended to be mourning. The children were filled with grief, their hearts heavy with the loss of their father, whom they believed had died in peace. They wept for him, remembering the man who had always been there for them, who had worked hard to provide and protect them. The funeral rituals were carried out with great care. The village elders led the ceremony, performing the traditional rites to ensure the spirit of the departed would find rest in the afterlife. Incense burned, and prayers were said. The family laid their father to rest, believing this was the end of their sorrow. Little did they know that this was only the beginning of their suffering. Not long after the funeral, strange things began to happen in the house. The once peaceful home seemed to carry a heavy, oppressive air. The children noticed it first, a strange chill that lingered in the rooms, whispers in the dead of night, and the feeling that they were never truly alone. The wife, though she pretended everything was normal, couldn't ignore the strange occurrences either. It was as though the house itself was mourning. Then, one night, just days after the funeral, the eldest daughter suddenly fell ill. It was so sudden that the family didn't know what to do. She had been perfectly healthy just the day before, but now she could barely move. Her body grew weak and her speech slurred. It was as though she had been struck by the same illness that had taken her father. She too had suffered a stroke. The family rushed to get help, but nothing could be done. The daughter's condition worsened rapidly. She lay in bed, her eyes filled with fear and confusion, unable to understand why this was happening to her. The mother, still consumed by her own bitterness, barely showed any emotion. The remaining children did everything they could to care for their sister, but within days, she passed away, her life cut short in the same way as her father's. The family was devastated. Losing their father had been painful enough, but now losing the eldest daughter left them in complete shock. The village mourned with them, offering their condolences, but there was a sense of unease in the air. Some of the elders began to whisper that something wasn't right. How could two members of the same family die so suddenly in the same way? There were murmurs of curses and spirits, but no one dared to speak openly about it. The grief-stricken family barely had time to process the loss of the daughter, when only a week later, tragedy struck again. The son, once strong and full of life, suddenly became ill as well. It was as if the sickness had passed from one family member to the next. The son, too, was struck down by a stroke, his body weakened and paralyzed, just like his sister and father before him. The remaining daughter and her mother watched in horror as the son's condition rapidly worsened. Despite their best efforts to care for him, nothing could be done to save him. Within days, the son passed away, leaving the family in even deeper despair. Now, only the youngest daughter was left, and she was consumed with fear. She couldn't understand why this was happening to her family, why her father and siblings had been taken from her so suddenly and in such a terrible way. The once happy family was now broken, their home filled with sorrow and loss. The remaining daughter was plagued by nightmares every night. She would wake up in a cold sweat, having dreamt of her father and siblings, their faces twisted in pain and sorrow. In her dreams, she saw her father, not at peace, but restless, as if he had something he needed to say. She saw her siblings, too, reaching out to her, their eyes full of sadness. The dreams haunted her, and she grew weaker with each passing day, consumed by grief and fear. The mother, too, began to feel the weight of her actions. Though she still tried to convince herself that she had done the right thing, a deep sense of guilt started to creep into her heart. She could feel that something was terribly wrong, that the strange illness that had taken her family was no ordinary sickness. She began to wonder if her curse had been the cause of it all. Had her anger and bitterness brought this misfortune upon her family? Was her husband's spirit seeking revenge for the way she had treated him? But the truth was still hidden, and the wife refused to acknowledge the full extent of her guilt. It wasn't until the last daughter, the only one left, began to lose her grip on reality that the truth would finally come to light. Finally, the truth came to light in the most painful way possible. The wife had been living in the shadow of a grave mistake. The mysterious lady who had arrived at their doorstep that fateful day was not looking for the husband after all. She had simply come to the wrong house. Her words about being a stepdaughter had nothing to do with the wife's husband or her family. The woman had meant to go to the house next door, but confusion had led her to their door instead. It was a heartbreaking revelation for the wife, who had spent so many years believing in a lie. The husband had never hidden anything from her. There had never been a secret stepdaughter, no betrayal, no hidden family. He had been innocent all along, yet she had allowed her rage and jealousy to consume her, poisoning her mind and heart. She had never taken the time to investigate the truth, never thought to ask her husband for an explanation. Her distrust and quick temper had blinded her, leading her down a path of destruction. As the truth sank in, the weight of her actions became unbearable. The curse she had placed on her husband, born out of misplaced anger, had destroyed not only him, but their entire family. Her rage had brought down the man she once loved, and in turn, their children had also suffered. The strokes that had claimed their lives seemed more like the physical manifestation of the bitterness she had nurtured for so long. Her husband had fallen ill on the very day she cursed him, and instead of showing compassion, she had let her anger guide her. Rather than caring for him, she had tried to end his life, only to find herself unable to go through with it. Yet, even then, she had refused to soften her heart. She had lied to her children and the entire village, sending her still living husband to the mortuary, abandoning him when he needed her most. The coldness she had shown him in his final days now haunted her like a dark cloud. The deaths of her children, one after the other, were like blows to her soul, yet she had never connected it to her own wrongdoing. But now, with the truth revealed, the realization hit her with a force she could not withstand. It was her curse, her bitterness, and her refusal to show kindness that had brought this fate upon them. She had been so blinded by her own pride that she had led her family to ruin. But the story did not end there. In death, her husband found no peace. His spirit lingered, wronged by the betrayal of the woman he had loved and trusted. In life, he had been faithful, working tirelessly to provide for his family. He had never hidden anything from his wife, but her lack of trust had cost him his life. And now, from beyond the grave, his spirit could not rest. The injustice of his suffering and the lies she had told weighed heavily on his soul. His spirit began to haunt the wife, visiting her in her dreams, tormenting her mind and soul. Each night, she would wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding as she relived the moments of her betrayal. She saw her husband in every shadow, felt his presence in every corner of the house. His ghost whispered to her in the darkness, reminding her of what she had done, forcing her to confront the truth she had tried to bury. The guilt was unbearable. The wife could no longer sleep, no longer eat. Her mind was plagued by visions of her husband's suffering, the helplessness in his eyes as he lay on his deathbed, and the faces of her children, struck down by the same illness that had claimed their father. She began to unravel, her sanity slipping away as the weight of her sins bore down on her. It wasn't just in her dreams that her husband tormented her. During the day, she would hear his voice in the wind, calling her name. Objects in the house would move on their own, as though touched by invisible hands. The air felt heavy with his presence, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape him. The once peaceful home, filled with laughter and love, had become a place of dread. It was as though her husband's spirit was everywhere, watching her, waiting for her to admit the truth. Finally, the burden became too much to bear. The wife, broken and filled with regret, could no longer hide from the truth. One day, in front of her remaining daughter and the few family members who still visited, she broke down. Through tears, she confessed everything. She admitted that the curse she had spoken in anger was the reason for her husband's stroke. She revealed that she had lied to everyone about his death, sending him to the mortuary while he was still alive. She wept as she told them how she had tried to kill him, how her bitterness had consumed her. The weight of her confession seemed to crush her. Her daughter, the only one left, looked at her mother with disbelief and sorrow. The mother's words hung heavy in the air, and the family could hardly believe what they were hearing. The truth was a terrible thing, and it left everyone in shock. But the spirit of her husband, now that the truth had been spoken, did not disappear. Though the wife had finally confessed, the torment continued. The guilt had already done its damage. The wife, unable to live with the consequences of her actions, began to waste away. She could not find peace, not even after admitting her wrongs. Her husband's spirit remained, haunting her every moment, until, at last, her mind and body gave in to the weight of her regrets. She died alone, tormented by the ghosts of her past, consumed by the guilt that had gnawed at her soul. In the end, her refusal to trust, her quick anger, and her unwillingness to show love had destroyed not only her family, but herself as well. This tragic tale serves as a warning to all who hear it. Never let anger cloud your judgment, and always seek the truth.